really good opportunities coming up at these Sundays. So my name is Maria Jacobs. Mark Miller and I are co-chairs of Sunday morning. And I would just like to say that next Sunday, our speaker will be from the Milwaukee Inspirational Theater in Milwaukee. And it's Alicia, and she will be doing some demonstrations and talking about conversational theater. And today, we welcome, our topic is the human security and nuclear dimensions of war in Ukraine. And the presenter is Tara Drozdenko. And she is with us today to talk about the topic. So thank you very much.
Okay, we're so glad that we are back in session again and meet in person. We've been working hard all summer, and I will see any of the committee members here. Well, Chris Schmidt is here with us. Oh, and so two committee members here, as well as Lauren and myself. Tara was a graduate of UCLA in physics. After graduation, she worked for the federal government, with the Navy, the State Department, the Treasury, and most recently, she's been with the Outrider Foundation Medicine, that is doing work with nuclear issues and climate change, and then of course she's now with the Union of Concerned Scientists. I've been a member of the Union of Concerned Scientists for a long time. So that was really good.
So this morning we're going to talk about human security and nuclear weapons. The risk of nuclear weapons has been with us for decades, but since the end of the Cold War, the threat of nuclear weapons has receded in most people's minds. However, sometimes current events bring that reality back to us. So, posturing in the U.S. and China over Taiwan is one example. The war in Ukraine is another. The fact of the matter is that along with the fall of the Soviet Union, Russia's war in Ukraine is probably the most consequential event having to do with weapons in my lifetime. Nuclear weapons hold us all at risk, but even when they aren't being used, they still cause immense harm to some communities. This morning we'll talk about the nuclear dimensions of the war in Ukraine and the continuing injustice of the nuclear weapons. We'll also talk about solutions and ways to reduce the risk in this present moment. And then let's talk a bit about the future. So first, the war in Ukraine. From day one of this conflict, Putin has hidden behind his nuclear weapons in order to carry out a conventional war in Ukraine. Earlier in the conflict, he announced a decision to raise the readiness level of Russian nuclear weapons. And Russian ally Belarus changed its constitution to allow hosting of nuclear weapons on its territory. And there are recent reports that Belarus may receive some short-range tactical nukes from Russia. And Russia continues to make veiled threats of nuclear use. Just this past July, Dmitry Medvedev, who used to be president, is now Russia's Deputy Security Council chairman. He warned that punishing Russia for war crimes threatened the existence of mankind. He said that the idea of punishing the country that has the largest nuclear potential is absurd in itself. So given this dangerous rhetoric and the Russian nuclear doctrine that calls for using nuclear weapons when the existential security of Russia is at risk, it is conceivable that Putin might choose to use tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine. A frustrated, nuclear-armed Putin might do enormous harm very quickly. Russia has a large, highly diverse nuclear arsenal, including as many as 2,000 short-range missiles that could lay waste to Ukraine, the Baltic states, and Finland. And if these short-range missiles were deployed to Kaliningrad or Belarus, then Putin could also threaten Poland, Slovakia, and Sweden. Russia's long-range, land-based, and sea-based nuclear missiles threaten most of the rest of the globe, including all of Europe and the United States. So let's be very clear, this is a dangerous situation. The possibility that a conflict could escalate to nuclear war through misunderstanding, miscalculation, or poor judgment is real. And in times of tension, like we have right now, even the slightest mistake could lead to unintentional escalation. Over the years, we've had a disturbing number of close calls and accidents. We've had early warning radars mistake natural phenomena for missile launches. There have been technical glitches that caused operators to lose contact with our early warning radars or with other parts of the US military complex involved in nuclear strikes. In one incident, a training tape was inserted into a NORAD computer and simulated a large-scale Soviet attack that appeared real to the operators. And in this incident, the US ICBM force was placed on its highest alert, and nuclear bombers prepared to take off. Russia has also had some close calls that we know about. In 1995, Norway launched a scientific rocket to study the aurora borealis. And to Russian early warning radars, it looked like it could have been a launch from a nuclear submarine. And apparently, the Russian president was notified and presented with the means to authorize a retaliatory strike. But when the radars didn't show any additional launches, the incident was declared a false alarm. Now, this incident took place during a time of low tension between the US and Russia. If something like that were to occur now, the outcome might be very different. Thankfully, none of these close calls led to an accidental nuclear attack. And if one of these false alarms were to occur right now, it might lead to a very bad outcome. But beyond the immediate risk of nuclear war, we should also be concerned about risk to the global international order. This war has already put an end to the strategic stability talks that the US and Russia were engaging in before the war. The US and Russia have just one remaining treaty that limits their nuclear arsenals. It expires in 2026, just 4 short years from now. And when it goes, there will be no legal constraints on the number and type of nuclear weapons that each country can build. Even more recently, Russia canceled planned inspections under this treaty, citing airspace restrictions due to the war in Ukraine. So this war is causing immense harm and damage to carefully built structures of arms control and disarmament between the US and Russia. And while it may seem inconceivable to dialogue with Russia in the midst of an active conflict, it's something that we need to be planning for if we do not want to repeat Cold War arms buildups. But US policymakers are already focusing on more military and nuclear spending as a result of the war in Ukraine. The Congress is about to pass the largest military budget ever. And they have refused to cancel an unneeded and unnecessary nuclear weapon, the nuclear sea-launched cruise missile, that the Navy doesn't even want. This larger budget and retention of the nuclear sea-launched cruise missile are direct results of the war in Ukraine. The US Congress is looking at the war in Ukraine and drawing the wrong lessons from it. It's also conceivable that other countries will take lessons from this war that are counterproductive to achieving a future free from nuclear weapons. Some states might see what is happening to Ukraine and decide that they need their own nuclear weapons. There are real risks to the non-proliferation regime because of this war.
But there doesn't have to be a nuclear war for nuclear weapons to hurt people. We tend to imagine that nuclear weapons have caused no harm since the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Or when we think about the harm from nuclear weapons, we think about the potential to harm. But the truth is more challenging and more painful. The true story of nuclear weapons is one of ongoing harm, of environmental contamination, and exploitation of powerless communities. There are three activities which are essential for a country to have nuclear weapons: uranium mining, nuclear weapons testing, and weapons production and maintenance. And all three of these activities are risky business. They are harmful for the people carrying out the activities, and they are harmful to the surrounding communities. It is impossible to build a nuclear weapons infrastructure without mining uranium, testing bombs, producing bombs, and maintaining them. And as a society, we have shifted the risk of these activities to communities with less wealth and less political power. All Americans have a perceived benefit of security from nuclear weapons, but not all Americans bear the risks equally. The first two activities that I mentioned, mining and testing, are not ongoing. Thankfully, they are historic. So we're going to talk about the historic injustice associated with it. The last activity, production and maintenance, is ongoing. So let's talk about that a little bit. Towards the end of World War II, the United States started mining uranium here in the United States on Navajo land. And the mining continued into the 1980s. So between 1944 and 1986, 30 million tons of uranium were mined on Navajo land. Uranium mining complicated the land rights of indigenous communities since it opened the land up to industry and private prospectors. And most of the miners were Navajo men, paid minimum wage or less to dig uranium out of their own land. Unaware of the dangers of uranium, many brought their families with them and settled near the mine. And when they came home from work, radioactive debris came home with them. Their children played in radioactive waste piles. Some built their homes out of the leftover rocks of the mines. And though the US government knew well the dangers of uranium mining, the workers were not warned and were not given protective equipment that would have mitigated the risks. Between the 1970s and 1990s, cancer rates doubled in the Navajo Nation. Studies showed that 27% of Navajo people had high levels of radioactive uranium in their body, 5 times higher than the US average. And some Navajo babies were born with uranium already in their systems. In 1990, the US government admitted responsibility for the mistreatment of uranium miners and paid compensation to miners with diseases related to mining work. There's no compensation for their families and children. The mines on Navajo land continue to leave a toxic legacy. They have contaminated the groundwaters and rivers. One of the most notorious contamination events was the Church Rock uranium mill spill on July 16, 1979. A tailings disposal pond reached its dam and over 1,000 tons of solid radioactive mill waste and 93 million gallons of acidic radioactive tailings solution flowed into the Puerto River. Contaminants traveled 80 miles downstream to Navajo County, Arizona, and the Navajo Nation. Shortly after the breach below the dam, radioactivity levels of river water were 7,000 times that of the allowable level for drinking water. Prior to the spill, local residents used the riverside for recreation and herb gathering, and children often waded in the part of the river. Burns acquired by some of those who came into contact with the contaminated water they developed serious infections that required amputation. Herds of sheep and cattle died after drinking the contaminated water, and children played in pools of contaminated water. The spill contaminated shallow aquifers and a river that residents drank from and used to water livestock. 17,000 people lost access to clean water after the spill. The accident released 3 times more radiation than 3 Mile Island, yet received far less media coverage. The governor of New Mexico refused the Navajo Nation's request that the site be declared a federal disaster area, limiting aid to affected residents. It seemed likely that classism and racism factored into the neglect. In 1983, the site was put on the national priorities list of the EPA's Superfund cleanup efforts. And some 40 years later, the site remains contaminated to some extent, though the EPA does have a remediation plan that includes continued water quality. The contamination continues. In 2015, a doctoral student at Northern Arizona University helped discover more than a decade of uranium contamination in the drinking water of a small community of Sanders, Arizona. Sanders lies just outside the Navajo Reservation, and about 80% of the community is Navajo. So during routine water quality testing in the community, one of the community members asked the team to sample a public water supply. They did and found elevated levels of uranium in the wells along the river, as well as in the public water sources. Looking deeper to figure out how long that contamination had been taking place, they found records indicating elevated levels of uranium as far back as 2003. All the tests from 2009 to 2015 showed elevated levels of uranium in the public water. The community members were never notified about the contamination, either by the state or the company which supplied the water. The water company violated the Federal Safe Water Drinking Act by not giving reports to their customers. The researchers presented their findings at several community meetings, and while people stopped using the public water, they were not seeing any movement by the state or water company to fix the contamination. During one of these meetings, community members asked researchers to test the well that supplies water to the elementary and middle schools. And they found elevated uranium in that water supply as well. The school district shut off the water fountains in the schools and started hauling water in from another town. And the school has since installed a new water filtration system. As for the town's public water supply, I haven't been able to find recent information about remediation for it, but I suspect people are still drinking bottled water, and that the contamination may not be fixed. Today, more than 500 abandoned uranium mines remain on Navajo tribal lands, land that is still contaminated. The Environmental Protection Agency is still trying to clean up the area. To date, they have cleaned up 9 mines. It's going to take decades. So that's mining. Let's move on to testing. In 1950, the United States opened a nuclear testing site at a barren stretch of land north of Las Vegas. The wind there blew east, away from big cities like Los Angeles, and towards sparsely populated Utah, Nevada, and Idaho. And the people who lived downwind of the test site were assured that only a negligible, safe level of radiation could reach them. A series of tests conducted in the spring of 1953 deposited especially large amounts of radioactive debris on towns and ranches downwind of the testing site. Ranchers started noticing that their sheep were getting sick. Some had burns on their faces and lips or blisters on their bodies, or their wool had sloughed off. Ewes began miscarrying in large numbers, and many lambs were born grotesquely deformed or too weak to nurse. A quarter of the herds in southern Utah and Nevada, around 20,000 sheep in total, died. And people in the area started to get sick too. The radioactive debris was seeding cancer and birth defects among the population. So in an effort to reassure the local communities, the Nevada test site manager wrote a report that was distributed in schools and to community groups. And he wrote, quote, "You are, in a very real sense, active participants in the nation's atomic test program. I want you to know that each shot is justified by national or international security, and that none will be fired unless there is adequate assurance of public safety." In 1990, Congress passed the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act. And under the act, people who suffered as a result of nuclear tests received payments from the government. So again, with nuclear testing, we see that in the name of national security, we've been willing to put some Americans at risk for the perceived gain of keeping all Americans safe. These communities were rural communities, not wealthy. Though not explicitly stated, they were deemed expendable for the sake of the rest of us. More on testing. Between 1946 and 1958, the United States tested 67 weapons in the Marshall Islands, a small string of atolls that are ring-shaped coral reefs in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. The islands were claimed by the United States during World War II, and nuclear testing began there soon after. One Sunday, in early 1946, U.S. Commodore Ben H. Wyatt spoke to the inhabitants of the Canadian atoll in the marshes. He spoke to the people in grand biblical terms, asking them to leave their home island for the good of mankind and to end all wars. So we see again this theme of asking this marginalized group of people to bear all the risks. All 167 island natives left their ancestral home, boarded a boat with their belongings, and relocated to the nearby uninhabited Rongerik atoll. The Bikinians struggled to scrounge out a living on Rongerik. It was not as bountiful in crops, coconuts, and fish. Meanwhile, back on their home island, the U.S. government was testing nuclear weapons. On March 1st, 1954, the largest nuclear test ever undertaken by the United States took place. It was called Castle Bravo. The Bravo device exploded with a force of 15 megatons, that's 1,000 times more powerful than the bomb dropped in the ocean. Its explosion blew a crater 1 mile across and 250 feet deep into the ocean. It incinerated 3 islands and sent pulverized and irradiated portal into the atmosphere. Hours after the explosion and 90 miles away, a fine, gritty dust started to fall on the islands of Rongelap, Uterik, and Olinkene. Children played in it, women put it in their hair, they thought it was snow. By nightfall, islanders developed diarrhea and vomiting. It was the first sign of acute radiation sickness. They developed burns on their skin, and their hair started to fall out. It would be 2 full days before the U.S. military came to evacuate. In the years that followed, cancers associated with radiation exposure, including leukemia and thyroid cancer, increased among the refugee population and those who moved back to independent lands. Women experienced reproductive issues, miscarriages, severe birth defects were common. Some birth defects were fatal, but so severe that people said the infants didn't even live. The fallout disaster that struck the inhabited islands was avoidable. On the morning of the test, weather bulletins clearly indicated that high elevation winds were blowing to the east, where these islands were. Officials in charge decided to move forward anyway. After the evacuation, the government started a project codenamed Project 4.1, which they described as an effort to provide health care and treatment to the Marshallese people affected by nuclear tests. But the project was also an effort to learn as much as possible about the long-term effect of radiation on the human body. Conducted under a cloak of secrecy to prevent bad public relations, Project 4.1 led to deep mistrust of the military by the Marshallese. They see themselves as human guinea pigs in a radiological experiment that was planned and executed by the U.S. government. So that's testing. Let's go on to production and maintenance. The Hanford site in Hanford, Washington, was a nuclear weapons production complex built on the Columbia River, central Washington state. The plutonium for most of the 60,000 American nuclear weapons built during the Cold War was produced at Hanford. It's been largely decommissioned since 1989. It is the most contaminated place in the United States. Approximately 2/3 of the nation's high-level radioactive waste is at the Hanford site. Cleanup efforts will likely continue for the next 50 years. It has already cost $110 million. Employees at Hanford claimed that they were discouraged from wearing protective gear and unsafe work environments. Hanford workers were not informed of the dangerous conditions, and were constantly reassured that all the materials they were being exposed to were safe. They were not. In 2009, tests showed that the mercury levels at Hanford were 473% above the admissible occupational limit. Ammonium levels were found to be 1,800% higher than the acceptable limit. Vapors from Hanford tanks were found to emit over 1,800 dangerous chemicals, many of which are confirmed carcinogens. The assurances of Hanford officials that the chemicals were safe have led to reports that the facility was mismanaged and failed, perhaps unlawfully, to protect workers from known dangers. The problems continue today. In August 2017, a test 3 miles away from Hanford found plutonium in the air. In May of 2017, a 20-foot section of tunnel collapsed. The tunnel was being used to store contaminated materials, and the collapse triggered an emergency shutdown of parts of the facility. While Hanford focused on plutonium production, the actual weapons were assembled elsewhere. The main hub for nuclear weapons assembly, maintenance, and dismantlement in the United States today is the Pantex nuclear plant in the Texas Panhandle. During World War II, the Pantex plant built nearly 4 million conventional bombs and artillery shells for the U.S. military. Afterward, they shifted production to nuclear weapons. For decades, employees at Pantex have faced serious health and safety hazards. Workers producing nuclear weapons are exposed to materials like beryllium. Beryllium causes cancer, tissue inflammation, and an incurable lung disease known as chronic beryllium disease. In 2000, the federal government implemented the Energy Employees Occupational Illness Compensation Program. Ostensibly, the program helps employees at plants like Pantex pay for medical treatment, but there are also extended delays in payment. Some claimants have argued that the government is purposely delaying paying benefits until after sick nuclear workers die. Paying a death benefit is cheaper than paying for extensive ongoing medical bills. We've been told that nuclear weapons help keep the peace, that they guarantee our safety and security. But this simply isn't the case. Nuclear weapons hold us all at risk, but for some of us, they are actively causing harm. In our present context, nuclear weapons are enabling violence in Ukraine. So let's move to talking about some solutions that reduce the risk. The war in Ukraine and the threats of nuclear use are exactly why we need to eliminate nuclear weapons. Some work that gives me the most hope on this is the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. This treaty prohibits participating in any sort of nuclear weapons activity, development, testing, production, acquisition, possession, stockpiling, use, or threats of use, all prohibited. The treaty also prohibits the deployment of nuclear weapons on our national territory and the provision of assistance to any state in the conduct of prohibited activities. It entered into force in January of 2021, and it is the ultimate solution, the one that brings true safety and security, the one we should be striving for. Because the fate of all humanity should not hang in the balance just because an aggrieved, despotic ruler is nostalgic for the days of Soviet empire. It's utterly ridiculous, and we don't have to do it. But while we wait for nuclear powers to arrive at the obvious conclusion about weapons abolition, there are things we can do to reduce the risk of nuclear war. So far, the US and NATO allies have mostly resisted further escalation. They did not respond in kind by raising the alert level of US nuclear weapons at the beginning of the war. They canceled a Minuteman missile test and have been very clear rhetorically they do not want a nuclear conflict with Russia. Right now, we need to focus to continue to be on de-escalating the situation, ensuring nuclear weapons are off the table, and ending the violence against Ukraine. We can also turn to implementing policies that reduce the risk of nuclear escalation now and in any future confrontations like this one. We don't have to be designed to this danger. There are things the US could do to reduce the risk of misunderstanding and miscalculation. We could declare a no first use policy, meaning that the US would commit to never be the first to use nuclear weapons in a conflict. This would assure other countries, like Russia, in the event of tensions, that we are not going to be the ones to start a nuclear war. We could end the president's sole authority to launch nuclear weapons and involve other officials in the decision to launch. Right now, the decision to launch nuclear weapons lies with the president. And with our policy of launching and aborting a nuclear attack, the president has to make a decision to launch in just a few minutes. If either of these policies were currently in place, our risk of misunderstanding and miscalculation right now will be lower. Lastly, we could cancel specific nuclear weapons programs to signal that we do not feel it is necessary to engage in a tit-for-tat arms race. Right now, as I mentioned, the nuclear sea-launched cruise missile is being kept on life support by the US Congress because the defense establishment has this entrenched belief that we have to match adversaries' nuclear capabilities on a one-for-one basis. It's a dangerous mindset that fuels arms races and feeds the ever-increasing military budget. These are things we can do in the present to make the world a safer place. But let's talk about what impact the war in Ukraine might have for the future of nuclear weapons, arms control, disarmament, and non-proliferation. I'll be honest, it's possible that in the immediate future, it will look like a step backward. As I mentioned, there are very real risks to arms control and non-proliferation issues that we will rely on for more than 50 years. But I think the future is not without hope. I take hope in the fact that non-nuclear weapon states continue to make headway in stigmatizing nuclear weapons. Ratifications to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons continue to roll in. And very optimistically, the war in Ukraine could be a catalyst for future conversations between nuclear weapon states about more arms control, more nuclear production. US and Russian leaders understand that a full-scale nuclear war would be a civilization-ending event. That's why just before this war started, leaders of 5 nuclear weapon states, including the United States and Russia, called the avoidance of war between nuclear powers their foremost responsibilities, and affirmed that a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. If both the US and Russia have been unnerved enough by a war on NATO's border and by the very real risk of nuclear escalation, perhaps we can find a way to make some progress together. It's also possible that these events might cause some re-examination of whether deterrence theory is the security paradigm we want to live in. Do we want to live in a world where we risk annihilation and the end of all civilization? Or can we figure out how to manage our international relationships without that threat hanging over our heads? I do see some cracks opening up in the armor of deterrence theorists. The non-governmental and advocacy groups that work on nuclear weapons are becoming more bold in their challenges to US reliance. And I take hope because all of you are here today. It's going to take all of us working together to move us to a better, more peaceful future. So thank you for being here, and thank you for your commitment to a safe, more peaceful world. Any questions if there's time?
Yeah, I think, I think there's enough volume in here that people can ask questions out here and anybody at home will be able to hear.
I can repeat the question into the mic if that would help.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Let's try it.
Anyone have questions? Yes.
I have a comment. It seems to me that in addition to the 3 problems with the nuclear arms that you talked about, with the mining and the production and the testing, that there's another problem is that all that money that could be used to spend on other things like education, providing food to people, etc.
Yes, that's a great comment. So I don't know if it came through, but someone commented that we spend a lot of money on our nuclear weapons, and that takes away from other really pressing priorities that we have in this country, like education and health. It's a great point. Yes.
I understand one of the priorities is so-called modernizing the nuclear armaments. What's that about? And how's that working and what's it cost and all that?
Yes. Okay. So the next question was about what's been termed modernization of our nuclear weapons. With that, it's very the term is not very clear about what it means, but what it means is actually we're going to build and replace every single weapon that we have in the US over the next 30 years. It's going to cost, the most recent estimate is $1.7 trillion over 30 years. If you look that out, I believe it's over $4 million every hour, every day in the next 30 years. It's a lot of money. Yeah.
But what does it mean modernizing? What are they trying to do with it?
Well, just rebuild all the weapons. You know, they're old. Our Minutemen have been in their silos for 30, 40 years. Some of our nuclear submarines are also that old. So they're going to replace them and build new ones.
Old technology that wanting to replace?
I don't know. I don't have access to, it's probably classified. I don't have access to that. I'm sure they're making improvements in the technology. Yeah. Yes,
You commented that this cruise missile, that's been advanced, has been rejected by the Navy as necessary. Is it a political thing? Is it a economic thing on the part of producers that's pushing it forward? I mean, if your own military is saying,
right.
we don't need this,
I
the
think,
experts are saying, we don't need this.
Yeah. okay, so this question is about the sea launch, the nuclear sea launch cruise missile. Who's pushing it? Why?
Yeah.
Because the Navy doesn't want it. There's a philosophy that a lot of the defense establishment has, which is that, for example, let's say Russia was to use a low-yield nuclear weapon in Ukraine, something like 15 kilotons instead of the 300 kilotons that are our ICBMs. How would the US respond to that? And should they respond? It shouldn't be a 300 kiloton nuclear weapon. We want to respond in kind with 15 kiloton nuclear weapons. So we need some smaller nuclear weapons so that we can maybe have a small nuclear war instead of a big one. And so the defense establishment doesn't want the US to only have the bigger options available. They want them to have the little options available. And so this sea launch cruise missile is a little option, one that we could use in a small regional nuclear war. And they feel like if other countries have these capabilities, they need to be able to match them on a one-for-one basis. So that is what's driving some of the retention of the nuclear sea launch missile in the military budget.
Thank you.
I think there were some questions over here.
If I could just comment, I think it's another aspect of it. The Defense Department has been very clever about getting contracts in each of the US House representative districts. So Congress likes it as a job creation thing.
That's true. There's a little bit more involved there as well. Yeah. Did you have a question over here?
I had a question. To talk about nuclear war seems bizarre because if a nuclear bomb goes off, we don't have to worry. We won't really be here. But my question is about the water. We all have to drink, and you can't eat money. Out near the Mississippi River, in the area there that is beautiful, there is right now in Wisconsin a huge hog farm with 850,000 hogs polluting the water, and it's been tested that the clay will not prevent the water from being polluted. And if that happens, the entire area down to Prairie du Chien, that whole driftless area, there will be no drinking water. I asked the head of the DNR, why didn't you prevent that? The reason they would only say no if it was 10,000 pigs. So this company came in just under that, 850,000. So these are the areas that we have to work at because our children and the future will not have drinking water, and that to me is devastating.
Chris makes a very good comment about the need for clean drinking water. Threats to, yes.
You didn't say anything about China and, what is the possibility that China would start, escalating their nuclear weapons program?
Yes. So the question is about China's military and nuclear program. So historically, China has been pretty constrained in their nuclear program. They only have about 300 nuclear weapons, whereas the US has 4,000 or so. And they've declared an no first use policy. They're the only major nuclear power to have declared a no first use policy. They don't keep their weapons, their warheads stored, mated to the delivery systems. They're stored separately, which is not how we do it in the US. We've got weapons ready to launch 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. That's historically. Perhaps in response to US modernization, China is beginning to feel a little bit worried and threatened. And so there's evidence that they've started building several hundred new missile silos in the desert. This could be an indication that China is going to start building more nuclear weapons. Definitely things between the US and China are not going down the right path. There's a lot of competition. The US military calls them a near-peer competitor in the nuclear space. It's possible things could get messy and not go the right direction between the US and China. I think we definitely need more dialogue with China and more opportunities to build bridges and help avoid misunderstanding.
Okay, thank you so much.
There's one last question.
And throw this in, that's nuclear war. What about the peaceful, building of energy plants and things like that? It seems to me like that's being used as a threat during the war in Ukraine. And so in a way, it's just as, unmanageable as the weapons. Is there a combined watchdog for that, or is the military over here and pollution over here?
Okay, so this last question is related to some of the dangers of the nuclear plants in Ukraine. It's definitely, or anywhere, yeah, it's definitely very concerning. The International Atomic Energy Agency monitors all nuclear power plants worldwide. And that they aren't authorized to look at military facilities. So yeah, separate.
Okay, thank you again so much.
Thank you.
For those at home, we will be ending the live stream at this time.